John Endres is the chief executive of the Institute of Race Relations, and we're going to be talking today about a report that has recently been let loose into the public. It was started off as Treasury's investigation, a forensic investigation into Eskom, going back, would you believe, to 2018. It's a mammoth report. John will give us more insights because he's been doing quite a lot of work into it. But before we move on, the IRR I've always regarded as the premier think tank in South Africa. Perhaps you can tell us why it is?
Well, I think one of the reasons is that it has been around for so long, since 1929, and has throughout its entire history relied very much on data gathering and analysis in order to understand the country that we live in and to figure out why things happen the way they do, and also, of course, what is going to happen next. And I think it's just that very long track record of looking very intensely at the country that has helped us to understand it, I think, very well.
And also come at it from a very independent perspective. It's not like you were pro the apartheid government by any means.
That's right. And I think that spirit of independence, fierce independence, is one that carries through to the present day. And I think also differentiates us from some of the market commentators who might have certain other interests that they also need to pursue in making their analyses. So sometimes our analysis has been regarded as being very harsh, but we can afford not to sugarcoat things. We can afford to say things the way we see them, and to be quite blunt. And I think that's been useful.
I can relate to that. Okay, from a media perspective. Sure. But John, let's get into this Eskom report. How long did it end up being, given that it's been on the go for nearly 6 years?
Yeah, so the entire report clocks in at 614 pages. But the actual work was conducted in quite a short period of time, 4.5 months. And I think what happened here is that Treasury has probably been wanting to get something like this done for quite a long time. But then at the budget speech last year, the finance minister promised quite a large amount of money to Eskom, over 250 billion rand. And I think this gave him the clout to say, if we're going to be doing this, then we need to understand what it is that we're funding. So we're going to get an independent group of people in to assess the coal-fired power plants. We need to get a proper view of what's wrong with them, what needs to be done, and otherwise this money is not going to flow. And I think that's where we got that report from, which was then finalized at the end of August last year.
That's quite important. Not quite. It's very important because Treasury has been trying to get this thing going since 2018, but the way you've outlined it, only now did it have the support of the political overlords to, in fact, go ahead and do the investigation.
Yes, and I mean, the report is marked confidential. And of course, several months, almost half a year passed since it was given to Treasury before it was released. And I would assume that Treasury might also have wanted to get civil society and the media looking at the report. And that's why they have released it, to have people like us just, reading it, figuring out what the conclusions are of this group of experts.
We saw from the release of papers on Cadre deployment after a long court battle there that there was a lot of redaction, in other words, blacking out of important facts that some people didn't want us to know about. Is there any of that in this report?
No, none that I could see. So there are no redacted parts, and also the page number seems to tally with the page total. So it looks right.
So well done, Enoch Godongwana, the finance minister, and of course the Treasury, one of those centers of excellence in the South African economy, which are rarer and rarer nowadays. But John, give us the major conclusions, if you would, because you and your team have looked at this very carefully.
So I think one of the most interesting insights for me was that we are, I think, all familiar with the great pathologies that afflict Eskom, and many of those are elaborated upon in very great detail in the report. But before we get into the problems, I'd like to talk a little bit about the compliments that the report also pays. And one of these is for the transmission grid. So the authors of the report are really at pains to point out that the reason for load shedding is not the transmission grid. They say the people managing the transmission grid are doing a really good job to prevent a blackout by managing load shedding, and also that the transmission grid itself is in excellent shape thanks to very good maintenance and very capable people managing it. They do say that the transmission grid is getting a bit old, so it's nearing its end of life and it will need to be replaced bit by bit. But as it stands at the moment, the transmission grid is not the problem. The problem really is on the generation side. And that is where the observations and conclusions really come in hard and fast. I must also emphasize that they focus very much on the operational aspects. So maybe towards the end of this interview, we'll get a little bit to the environment within which Eskom is operating, which I think is a really important part of the Eskom story. But on the operational side, what the experts say is that effectively, where there are good people in Eskom, and they are around, they're not able to do their jobs properly because the management systems are so complex that they get snarled up in red tape. So everything needs multiple rounds of approvals. Procurement processes are very opaque. A lot of the maintenance work has been outsourced. And so you can imagine if you're at a power station, you're the power station manager, something breaks, then you say, oh, damn, now I've got to go find the contact number of the outsourced person who's going to fix this. Then I need to get approval to get them to do the job. Then I need to establish a committee maybe to sort out whatever needs to happen. And ultimately, everything takes very, very long to do, and it doesn't get done well. And so their core conclusion is that if you want to fix this, you have to empower the power stations themselves. You have to give authority to the power station managers. You have to simplify their procurement processes. You've got to give them a target and say, you as the power station manager have now got responsibility for this power station. You go and run it properly. And as long as you don't do that, you're still going to be stuck in these endless swirls of red tape and regulation that slow things down.
But I guess in the private sector, those who are consuming this conversation would say, but that's obvious. But in the public sector, not so obvious. There's different things at play when you're in the state employ. And I guess there, it's not that easy just to say someone down the line gets more responsibility because it means me up the line will get less.
Yes, this is true. It also is reflected in the fact that money doesn't really seem to be the problem. So one of the things the authors also looked at was maintenance budgets, and they created a benchmark across various continents to figure out where the maintenance budget levels should be set. They say South Africa is above the average, so we've got more than enough money for maintenance, but our energy availability factor is at 51 compared to the international benchmark of 78. So what they're pointing out is that the problem is precisely management. And of course, that extends across the entire sphere of government in South Africa. So almost any entity that you care to look at, the problem really is management. It's not the money so much. It's education, it's healthcare, it's Eskom, it's water, it's the municipalities. Mainly the problem is management.
From what you've said now, it again illustrates or emphasizes how important it is to have the right people in the right jobs. There's a lot of discussion recently about Cadre deployment and how a little committee in Luthuli House has decided on all the top jobs within the public sector. Are you able to just unpack for us what Cadre deployment means and whether any of that has happened in Eskom?
Yeah, I think it's very likely that has happened. So Cadre deployment, the background really is that the ANC taking over 1994 was worried that it wouldn't be able to manage the state and have the authority to implement the policies that it wanted to implement, and said that it needed to extend its control over all the centers of power in society. And that was very broadly defined. So it meant not only government departments, but also the media, business, the police, the army, etc., etc. So it was effectively a power grab by the party, which wanted to make sure that it wouldn't be challenged in its position. And that has led to so much of the dysfunctionality that we live with now. As is so often the case with ANC policies, the results are the opposite of what is intended. And in this case, Cadre deployment was meant to strengthen the hold of the party over the country. And the consequence has been to weaken it because the people deployed to the positions have not been capable enough, able enough to fulfill their jobs. And as a result, support for the ANC is now dropping because service delivery is failing under the policy of Cadre deployment and the politicization of the state. And in Eskom, that certainly will have been the case as well. All of the SOEs, I think, are seen as strategic national assets, as parts of the centers of power that need to be aligned with an ANC policy thrust and worldview. And that, of course, also enabled the great era of state capture under Jacob Zuma. And that allowed him to place the people in positions of power that he wanted to see there, and allow the hollowing out of state institutions as well as Eskom.
It's a very rational way that you've put it forward. Does that mean that it had the right intentions from an ANC's perspective? In other words, improve service delivery so that we get voted into power until the second coming. But in fact, it's had an unintended consequence, which has brought South Africa to the position where in the last 10 years, we've had a single year where the economy's grown faster than the population growth rate, which means we're going backwards.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I think the intentions might have been benevolent, maybe partly not, and that's a bit hard to say. But I think the effect has been that where the intention was very clearly to strengthen control, the effect ultimately has been to weaken it. And we see that with other policies as well. If you think of the ANC wishing, for example, to reduce concentration in the economy, but through its policies actually increasing concentration in the economy. So one example here would be companies making provisions for constant load shedding. It's the larger companies that are able to invest in alternative power supply or alternative water supply or transport arrangements. But it's the smaller companies that find it quite hard to deal with that. So ultimately, you see more consolidation and more concentration in the economy as well, which is quite the opposite of what the ANC intended.
How much of the report calls for action now, urgent action? We know that we've still got load shedding. We know that Eskom is in a precarious situation still, and the taxpayers have put in 500 billion up until the previous budget. I did the numbers to keep it going. Are there any action points that the authors of the report urged were to be implemented urgently?
So looking at the language of the report, mostly it is really very calm and technical and they're very unemotional, I would say. But sometimes you do see their sense of concern breaking through the technical language, where they say, action has to be taken immediately, or action has to be taken very urgently because this risk of breakdowns is so great. The actions they recommend are quite specific. They do go through every single power station in a very systematic way and discuss what needs to happen at each. You'll also find in the report photos of the various power stations, pointing out what is in good shape, what's in bad shape, or for example, where dust is allowed to accumulate in the great halls where the power is made. They say this is poor housekeeping, and that's both a technical problem but also a management problem. It reflects that staff is poorly motivated and something has to be done about this. They do point out that the Eskom Academy of Learning, which is the Eskom Learning Center, is potentially world-class, but needs more resources. And in terms of personnel, they say that a way has to be found to motivate personnel more. For example, by giving the power station managers authority for their power station, also giving staff clearer signs of recognition for work well done, and also recognizing that many of the power stations are located in very isolated spots far away from towns, and therefore they urge that accommodation should be offered on-site at the power station, and that maybe bonuses should be paid to the workers who work in the most isolated areas. But I would like to just mention this one sort of very hair-raising recommendation, which relates to 3 of the power stations, which is Medupi and Matimba on the one hand and Kendal on the other hand. And at all of those 3 power stations, there are problems with the water treatment plants. Medupi and Matimba share one treatment plant and Kendal has a separate one. But if these water treatment plants should fail, it would mean an immediate 10 stages of load shedding if it is Medupi and Matimba, and an immediate 4 stages of load shedding if Kendal goes off-grid. And that is a kind of point risk that, I think needs very urgent and very immediate attention, because it's single cause. It's just one thing that needs to break to get 10 stages of load shedding on top of whatever's floating around in terms of load shedding stages at that time.
What are the likelihoods, or what is the likelihood of this being addressed? And in particular, this very urgent issue of the water treatment plants?
I don't know, Alec. I don't know if I so strongly hope that they are looking at it very intensely. A little bit worried that this report was not published for 6 months, and we don't quite know what happened during that time. I think there was an Eskom comment that came out the day after the report was released, speaking a little bit about the work that they had been doing. but I'm not clear on what they're doing on those water treatment plants.
John, when Andre de Ruyter's book came out, it was disavowed to a large degree by the politicians, and certainly other people in the public sector said it was excessive. Would he feel vindicated by what is in this report, now this official report from Treasury?
I think he would. I think he would recognize many of the failings that he saw on his plant visits reflected in this report. I think he would probably also wonder whether he could have done more to empower those power station managers. But I think ultimately Andre de Ruyter was caught up in the environment that Eskom is still caught up in, which will prevent many of these improvements from happening. And that is something we pointed out in that risk alert we published earlier in the week, which is that Eskom operates in an environment where preferential procurement means they can't buy on a value for money basis. They have to take into account transformation targets. They can't hire on a purely skills basis. They have to take into account transformation targets. They can't operate on a purely commercial basis because they are subject to political interference with, 4 ministers at least taking an interest in their operations and feeling empowered to tell Eskom what it needs to do. And I think as long as all of these things remain in place, as long as Eskom cannot operate on a commercial basis with a clear commercial mandate, but rather has to take into account lots of conflicting interests and interference from the political sphere, as long as that is the case, it will not operate properly. It will not operate efficiently.
We've got an election on the 29th of May. First of all, how are you reading the likely outcome of that election at the IRR? And more specifically, as far as this report is concerned, what would be required for those policies or that are now holding back Eskom and indeed the economy as a whole to be addressed?
So looking at the election outcomes, if you'd asked me 4 weeks ago, I would have put the ANC at 50 plus minus 2 and would have said that the policy outcome of that election would have been the same. No matter whether the ANC was at 48, 47, 52, that would not have made a difference because the ANC would have been able to continue in power, maybe with the help of some smaller parties, but those would not have shifted ANC policies very far. However, now we see new polling coming out of the province of KwaZulu-Natal, especially on that new party, MK, Jacob Zuma's project. And I think that is actually shifting the numbers quite dramatically. And we probably are looking at the ANC in the low 40s. That is a very significant moment in South Africa's history. The option space, the number of possibilities, branching possibilities that emerge from this potential election result is proliferating wildly. And I think, when we get asked what is going to happen, it is even harder to say what is going to happen now than it would have been 4 weeks ago or a year ago, because just so many more options are becoming available. I think one of the options that we might see coming out of this would be some form of government of national unity, where the ANC, recognizing that it is now, suffered quite a substantial loss, will aim to take a leadership role in society by bringing together parties from across the opposition benches to help fix the problem under the wise guidance of the president, Cyril Ramaphosa, who's of course very focused on consensus and summits and committees and task rooms. So there would be infinite scope under such a government of national unity for such devices to be employed. The governance outcome, I think, would be one where the government will be mainly preoccupied with itself rather than with the outside world. And that is also true for many of the other scenarios. So if you think of an unstable coalition government, if you think of a minority government, if you think of a government of national unity, in all of these situations, a lot of the bandwidth of the politicians is going to be consumed by managing relationships with other politicians, which means that they will not have as much time to dedicate to the rest of the country and the economy, which may even end up being a good thing. So if we consider this tussle that we're seeing between Treasury and the rest of Cabinet playing out in this Eskom report, but also in many other areas, quite possibly the Treasury would be relieved to have the politicians fighting their battles somewhere off in Parliament and for the professionals at Treasury to get on with the job of managing the country's finances, and also, as much as they can, averting disaster from the country. One of the macro notes from the Treasury, I think, pointed out that between 2011 and 2019, the value of foregone economic growth as a result of logistical problems and load shedding alone was 2 trillion rand. So there are unimaginable sums of money being wasted as a result of bad management, which is unfortunately the consequence of ANC policy.
John Endres is the Chief Executive of the Institute for Race Relations, and I'm Alec Hogg from BizNews.com.